Good afternoon and welcome to CCEJ's Workplace Inclusion Network webinar, Diversity and Inclusion to Racial Equity. We are so honored and excited to have almost 200 people with us today to view wonderful, wonderful stories and guidance on difficult topics that we all have been hearing and talking about for at least the last 6 months. I'm Reena Hajat Carroll, the Executive Director of CCEJ, and our mission is very simply to eliminate bias, bigotry, and racism. We've been in the community for the last 60 years, and we are honored to be doing this work with groups all across the country. Today, we have a really wonderful group of panelists that you will hear from in just a moment. But before we get started with our discussion, we're going to watch just a really short video to give you a little bit of a window into the work that we have been doing for decades to really bring to the forefront issues of oppression, discrimination, and all the various isms. So please just sit back and watch a very brief video on our Building Bridges Youth Camp that was promoted and produced by our food and beverage industry.
Being done by CCEJ here at the camp is really, really important. It's such a diverse world. And to teach these kids the skill sets on how to get along with everyone, how to engage with other people, how to be advocates on important topics, to stand up in a safe way. And this is something I just don't remember being taught in college and growing up in my neighborhood. I didn't learn those things. So this is really terrific what CCEJ is doing for these students.
My favorite part of the interaction with the kids were the fact that we sit in a circle together and share experiences. And I was quite surprised that you had two adults in the group, and they were so vocal about their feelings and felt very safe to express what's important to them. And obviously we were able to share what was important to us as well. And it was neat to see that interaction.
It's really, difficult to say sometimes, but there is bigotry in this world. There's racism in this world. There's people that aren't included. I think all people are equal. I think everybody has a role in this world and a special, gifts that they can do to help contribute. And we have to give them a platform to do that. We have to be able to give them a way to do that. And CCJ is doing that. They're a catalyst for change. They're an organization that's going out there and changing each individual day by day to make a difference for all of us in the community.
CCEJ is all about building a culture of connection, and what I see today and the work that I've done with CCEJ in the past, they do a lot in terms of healing conflict and breaking barriers and bridging gaps between people. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in society to support this kind of work. And I'm proud and happy to work for a company that supports the efforts of CCEJ.
Thank you. Thank you for watching our short video on the Building Bridges Camp, and thank you so much to the food and beverage industry. Many of you are on the call today: Albertsons, Coca-Cola, Ralph's, Mondelez International, Barilla. There are so many of you that have supported our work for decades, and we would not be able to do it without you. So thank you. Thank you for the support, and thank you for continuing to use us as a resource. And thank you to all of our panelists. These are many people that I have known for years and have learned from and learned with, and I could not be more excited to be spending the next hour with them. So I'm going to ask if we could do some brief introductions. Marsha, if I could start with you, and then we'll go to Dan, and then Tim, and then Orvin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marsha Schnirring. I'm secretary of the college at Occidental College, which means I work with the Board of Trustees, and I'm a librarian by training. Happy to be a participant in this. I'm a member on our campus of both our Equity and Justice Committee and our Restorative Justice Committee, and look forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Hi, my name's Dan Chavez. I'm a partner with PwC, currently based in Chicago. I have the privilege of serving clients primarily in the renewable energy and utility spaces, and perhaps an even bigger privilege of leading PwC's Latino Inclusion Network across the US and in Mexico. Thanks, Reena, for the invitation to share some of my perspectives, and really looking forward to learning with everyone else today.
I'm Timothy O'Leary. I'm the General Director of the Washington National Opera at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. That's the Kennedy Center behind me as my virtual background, because I'm actually in my attic, which has become my home office, and the virtual background will help shield the view of any of my children bursting in during the webinar. I'm very grateful to Reena for the invitation to be part of this. She and I knew each other in St. Louis, where I was able to serve on the board of the Diversity Awareness Partnership. And then in my spare time, I'm also serving as the chair of the board of Opera America, which is the service organization for opera companies throughout the country. And all of this work is as important a topic as anything we're dealing with in the arts these days.
Hi, I'm Kimbrough, Chairman and CEO of Midwest Bank Center, St. Louis's second largest privately held bank. Really excited to be here, one of only a handful of African-American bank CEOs in the country. So excited for this conversation.
Thank you all. And I really just want to start in a simple place as we dive into a deeper discussion. It has been an intense past few months of conflict, of conversation, of grief, of trauma. And I really just want to check in with you all just to see how you are. How are you doing? How have you been processing everything that's been going on? So just sort of a quick check-in before we move into some of the bigger questions. Marsha, can we start with you and then go to Dan and Tim and Orvin?
Well, as you say, Reena, it has been an incredible 6 months. And you know, my emotions have ranged from exhilaration and hopefulness to profound discouragement. And I think part of what has contributed to that, in addition to the events in the world, is the fact that we're physically separated from each other. So those ways in which we can connect in an embodied form are missing for many of us, particularly in the Los Angeles area. So there's a sense of being isolated in one's sorrow and grieving over events, and a real need to be able to connect. So grateful for the opportunity to do this virtually.
Yeah, so I would echo, certainly the roller coaster of emotions over the past 6 months has been drastic. So if you ask me at 5 p.m. Central, I may give you a different answer, but at this point in time at 3:10 Central in the United States, I'm doing okay. You know, I've been fortunate, even today, I've been fortunate to have a number of discussions with colleagues who are Black, and to check in with them. And when I check in with them and they tell me how they're feeling, that gives me energy, that gives me motivation, that gives me optimism, that gives me inspiration. And so right this second, particularly able to participate on this panel and have this discussion, I'm doing reasonably well.
I appreciate the question. The short answer for me is I'm fine. It's been the hardest period of my life, but I am privileged in any number of ways. Obviously, I'm a white male person, and so I was born into this world with a great deal of privilege. I'm privileged to still have a job, especially in the arts. I'm, responsible for trying to steward an institution through an incredible period of time, but so many of the people that actually make our art are not able to work right now. And it's true in, of course, so many industries. So this is it's a health crisis, it's a social upheaval, it's an economic crisis, it's been a human crisis for so many of the people that, that serve as sort of my source of inspiration on a daily basis. We were able to give an outdoor concert, opera. I don't know if you follow, I'm an opera producer. If you followed the news, you know that one of the profound worries about the virus and opera singing is that, well, singing of any kind is one of the kinds of things that generates the spread through the air. And so our very product is not safe the way that it normally has been. And so we had an outdoor concert with 2 singers the other night, and I could not believe how incredible it felt to be back doing what Marsha referred to, which is connecting people in a physical space. The loss of that connection during this period of time has been hard to even comprehend. So it's been a challenging period, but I am just so grateful to be healthy, to be gainfully employed, and then actually to have the opportunity as somebody responsible for an institution to try to rise to the challenge of this moment when it comes to racial justice. And in the arts, we have a responsibility to make sure we're telling the right stories and lifting up the right voices. So that's the opportunity that we have.
Yeah, I think so much of this moment really just goes back to what Tim just said, and that is rising to the challenge. I'm hopeful, I'm motivated, but I am exhausted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the honesty. I think exhaustion is something that all of us have felt on so many different levels. And I really think we are at this point just going to jump right into our conversation. And so I'm curious from Orvin and Dan's perspective, you all I know lived through Ferguson, you lived through Michael Brown. This is not your first time seeing protests. This is not your first time having these conversations around racial justice and racial inequity. So I'm really curious for Orvin and Dan, for you all to share a little bit about how this moment feels different for you, if it does.
So I'll start there. And what I would say is in the immediate aftermath of Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson, and on the heels of days of protest, the governor of the state of Missouri established a commission. Reena, you may remember this, and it was in effect established to examine what went wrong. The commission outlined in this very lengthy document, it was a 204-page report, and through its 189 recommendations that, quote, change requires different choices, different decisions, and different actions. Change requires new effort, new relationships, and new habits. Change requires letting go of the known and wading through the unfamiliar of the dark of the unknown, end quote. The commission's report, while packed with a lot of superfluous words, had some very specific things that the region, the state, and the nation could do to create a more just and equitable society. But sadly, there was little, if any, real commitment from people who occupy the most powerful positions of government, the most powerful positions of philanthropy, and the most powerful positions as leaders of our corporations. So as one leader said to me, this too shall pass. And she was correct. There was a thin ray of hope that 2014 would be a defining moment for our nation and advantage. So you ask, what about this moment feels different? Those who are on the street protesting look like the American demographic in all of its diversity. We're seeing protests across the world because there is a recognition that injustice for Black people isn't just an American phenomenon. I think this is a very intense moment, as all of the speakers have talked about, where people are recognizing the communities that we share and that we are human beings at our core, and they're recognizing the frailty of life. In 2014, I didn't see people across the world in the sustained way that we are seeing today protest. I didn't see corporate leaders taking the kinds of stances that they are now taking, denouncing racism and being challenged to put their money where their mouth is. Think about it for a second. You mentioned Coke is on this call. The CEO of PepsiCo put out a statement that essentially said, Black Lives Matter to our company and to me. And then he committed $400 million over a 5-year period. They then committed to expand their Black managerial population by 30%. They're going to double down on spending with Black-owned suppliers and will invest $20 million to create opportunity and advance economic empowerment for Black Americans. Groups like the Business Roundtable, one of the most powerful because of who its membership is, have indicated that they too are committed to doing their part and leveraging their scale. So Reena, this moment feels like a different moment. It feels like a moment where we can absolutely democratize access to opportunity and shared prosperity, but only time will tell if this is a sustained moment where the commitments that we make are actually the commitments that we live into.
Yeah, I fully agree with Orvin's assessment. From the engagement of the business community being elevated, from the engagement of the global community being elevated, from the engagement of white folks being elevated, it certainly feels different than what we saw and experienced and lived in 2014. Marsha and Tim both mentioned earlier the impacts of lockdown, of COVID, and that, in my estimation, is certainly also changing the way that this moment is being experienced. Had we all not been on lockdown, for lack of a better term, had we all not been confined to smaller geographical regions, it would have been easier to ignore. Just saying it quite simply. If I were getting on the L every day and having the 45 minutes on the L to do whatever I do, I wouldn't have had that 45 minutes at home to sit and reflect. I wouldn't have had as much information in my face appropriately, but in my opinion, in my face. So I think, the impact of COVID at this moment has also changed the feel and enabled people to get a little bit more information and to get a little bit more involved. The other thing I'd say is I don't recall in 2014 that the young folks of our country and of our world were as engaged at the scale that they seem to be currently engaged. It feels, again, this is a feeling, I don't have hard data, but it feels like the youth of America is recognizing that this is their country too, and that they are responsible for shaping the way that the country evolves, and that they are engaged and excited to shape the way that the country evolves. And I didn't feel it at this scale and at that intensity in 2014 as compared to 7 years later.
Reena, could I add something at this point? I absolutely agree with Dan that I think there's a benefit in this pause that we've had in terms of our frenetic pace of life. And I appreciate the fact that we've actually been given an opportunity to stop and think more deeply about the issues that are facing us. I also was reflecting when Orv was talking about in 2015 on our college campus, we had some very active student protests, and Black Lives Matter at that time picked up the phrase about it being a moment and saying it's not a moment, it's a movement. And yet that movement did seem to stall for a while. And that was part of the exhilaration I felt that I mentioned earlier during this past 6 months, is seeing it pick up. And as Dan said, seeing how widespread the interest is, and seeing our youth become so engaged across the country. I'm a child of the 60s, and I've been waiting and waiting and waiting to see that energy come back again. And it does feel like it is here.
And Marsha, if I could stay with you on this point and then move to the rest of you to talk about how do you sustain the energy and the endurance. Orvin talked a little bit about the energy he's sensing people having right now. And we know that this work is not ending. We know we have to seek endurance and we have to have stamina. So I'm curious from your perspective, what are you doing personally? What have you been doing to sustain the work? You've been in this work, you've been an advocate for a number of years. How have you sustained yourself?
Well, I think there's several things that contribute to maintaining a certain level of energy and commitment. And so one of them is I happen to actually be a regular meditator. And I find that is making a huge difference for me. And I've actually increased the amount of time that I spend meditating. It helps me to still the unsettled parts of my personality and allow me to listen more deeply. The second thing is I am so fortunate that I work on a college campus where there is a whole community, and Oxy has a long-standing commitment to and reputation for embracing the hard to discuss issues. We don't always do it well, but we do embrace it. So I'm supported by a community of people and we support each other in that. So when somebody is lagging or feeling down, somebody will step in and, lift them up.
Thank you. Tim, do you have thoughts on that, on how you're sustaining your own sort of stamina and energy at this work?
Well, I've never been a meditator, but I did during the pandemic buy a bike. I haven't ridden a bike, since I was in 5th grade. Now I'm biking regularly. And there's something about that is re-energizing. But I think actually the question of sustaining a commitment to institutional change, I was among the institutional leaders during the sort of peak of the George Floyd protests who were tortured by the question of, all right, well, we need to be standing with the protests and making statements, but if the statements seem to be performative and insufficient and not backed up by action, then they're, harmful, not helpful. And so we were all twisting ourselves around to figure out what was the right thing to say and then what were the right things to do. So actually very recently in my field, a sort of gift was given to institutions like mine, which is the formation of something called the Black Opera Alliance, which is, a sort of forum of, I think it's 700 artists and administrators in the opera world. And they sent us all something that's called the Pledge for Racial Equity and Systemic Change in Opera and invited us to sign on. And all of our institutions have been doing this work, or most of our institutions have been doing this work in a deep way for many years. But to be frank, we are in the opera world overwhelmingly white-led institutions, and we've been doing our best. Well, here was the opportunity that comes from all the Black artists and administrators in the business to say, these are the issues that we are asking you to focus on and commit to by signing on to this pledge. So we, the Washington National Opera, did sign on to the pledge. I mean, that was literally last week. And already I can feel a new sense of accountability because we've previously had the commitment to hold ourselves accountable. Well, now we have the partnership of the Black Opera Alliance, which has promised to hold all of our institutions accountable. And I think that's exactly the kinds of mechanisms that we need. And I find it inspiring. And I found it a great opportunity to sort of experience leadership from within the field, not top down, but from within. So these are the kinds of things that are, because every day something changes, it is exhausting, as Orvin said, but there is so much energizing change and opportunity.
Tim, I'm so glad you brought up the pledge. From arts to higher ed to business, we are seeing some form of pledges happening. students are making demands and requests of their administrators. Marsha, you've been seeing this now for years. Tim, you just talked about your pledge. Dan, I know PwC actually launched the CEO pledge years ago. Can you all talk a little bit about, from the business community, what are you doing to foster a more inclusive and a more anti-racist climate and environment? So Dan and then Orvin.
Yeah, well, Reena, you mentioned it. I'm incredibly fortunate to be a partner at PwC, led by our CEO. His name is Tim Ryan here in the U.S., who has for 5 or 6 years been unapologetically forward in discussing within the walls of PwC and publicly discussing the importance of equity and inclusion and having difficult conversations. It's one thing to say, like we're doing today, you should have difficult conversations. What I've seen within my organization, within other organizations like Procter & Gamble and a handful of others, is not just, hey, we should have these discussions. It's, hey, we should have these discussions and we're doing it. Like, watch it. This is an example of how it can be done. So I think giving those examples has been really powerful, showing people what it means to have a difficult conversation. I think that's been pretty powerful. You mentioned we were fortunate to co-lead CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, which was launched 3 or 4 years ago. To date, we've had over 1,300 CEOs sign on to that and make a pledge, which has 2 or 3 elements to it, things around unconscious bias training, creating environments where people can have difficult conversations, things of that nature. We've also now co-launched the CEO Action for Racial Equity, which is focused on getting people together from organizations. So employers will donate some of their employees for a period of time, 2 years, to actually come together and figure out how to use data, how to use modeling, how to influence public policy, and do it. So funded by our volunteer corporations, but also donating their skills and their know-how and their people to get it done. A lot of times people say, you've got to do the work. Companies are giving their people to do the work. So I think that's been pretty outstanding. And then a lot of companies are giving what they can, whether it's money, whether it's offering unconscious bias trainings to their people, whether it's giving their people dedicated time off on the clock to volunteer for organizations that nonprofit organizations that are focused on racial injustices and equity. Companies are, what we're seeing is stepping up and actually taking action. It will be interesting, hopefully encouraging, to see that companies sustain this level of commitment and sustain this action focus. So I'm optimistic that'll happen. I know within professional services firms, we're seeing it, and I fully, as a leader in a professional services firm, fully expect my organization and all of the others with whom we compete to keep walking the walk, to keep walking the talk. And if we don't, then we're being short-sighted and not upholding our obligations to our people and to the society that it has enabled us to be successful.
So I would just echo what Dan just said, and really the heart of your question, Reena, is how are we as corporations fostering these sorts of dialogues and discussions within the company. I would say dialogue and discussion is important, and I'll hit on that in a second. But I think so many people who are on the losing end of this deal, I think they're tired of dialogue. I honestly believe that we are at that pivotal moment in this country where the folks who are at the bottom, who continue to be at the bottom, who continue to be on the other side of empty promises, are just tired. And what's happening in this country is that group is getting bigger. So while as a country, that group is disproportionately Black and brown, you even have more and more whites in that group now. So the conversation, while it's important for us to talk about race, you're going to start to have economic conversations here in a minute, because the path that we are on as a country is unsustainable. So I would just say that it is ultimately about us as corporate leaders challenging our systems, challenging and changing our policies that change our practices, that change our behavior. So when we talk about just this idea of how you bring people together to actually tackle and create the environment where you can talk about racism, I'll tell you how I've done it. From an organizational standpoint, I have read pieces that I have written on race and racism during town hall meetings, and I've encouraged our leaders to talk to their teams. But I don't think that it's sufficient to just have the conversation. We also have to continue to look at our policies. I have been clear to my white friends, and I have a lot of them, that in the space of conversation, there is no question related to race that is off limits with me. Now, some Black people might tell you something different, and I don't purport to speak for all Black people here. But what I say is there is no question that's off limits. They can ask me any question without feeling like I'm going to judge them. And when people feel judged, they shut down. At the same time, I communicate that by virtue of me allowing you to ask me any question, I in turn will speak my truth and challenge your thinking and the condition of your heart. Let me tell you just a brief story by way of example. Not too long ago, I had a buddy who happens to be a white guy to reach out to me after reading a paper that I wrote, Share Prosperity. When I distributed this paper, I said that I'm willing to have open dialogue and receive feedback. He began by telling me that there are many of the 7 points that he agreed with. In the paper, I talk about a wholesale change of heart. He said, Orv, I agree. We as corporate leaders need to have a wholesale change of heart. In the paper, I talk about it's more than a writing checks. We get seduced by charity. Charity can become an elixir. He said, you know what? I absolutely agree with that. On the third point, I said, you got to commit to investing in Black businesses and open up supplier programs beyond white women. Let's unpack the numbers so that we can see what we're actually doing in these programs. He said, yeah, Orv, I agree. I said, you got to use your platform to help others and occupy your space. In other words, you got to sponsor Black and brown people. He said, I get it. Yes, I'm with you. Then I said, we must help people deep in the bowels of our companies to see the value. It's insufficient that if we get this at the top, we've got to actually push it throughout the organization. He said, yep, stay with me, 2 more points. I said, you got to look outside your network when hiring for talent. Most of our networks look like us. He said, yeah, I agree. I said, it's about inclusive economic environments, and this discussion starts at the top. He said, absolutely, I get it, and I have tried. The social worker in me came out. I said, tell me more. He said, I hired a Black person who was just average, and he didn't work out. So I felt like I have done my part because I've tried, or I paused and I asked him, not in these words, but I said, how many average white people do you have on your team? The point here is that Black and brown people have to be exceptional to even get a seat at the table. And I was trying to get him to understand that he's got to change his heart. He's got to change the condition of his heart. Talking about race starts with us just being human, being empathetic, being vulnerable, and giving everybody the benefit of the doubt. But talking absent policy changes gets us nowhere.
Thank you. I have so many pieces that I want to respond to with that, but I want to talk about for one quick second what it means to be exceptional as a professional of color. I was just having this conversation with staff yesterday about how important it is to start meetings on time and end them on time, and punctuality, right? And how this is so critical for people of color because we don't get a second chance when we walk into a meeting late. That says so much about who we are when white people can walk into meetings late all the time and they don't get the same level of judgment or critique, right? So these are the different types of microaggressions and inequities that professionals of color have to deal with all the time. And we are in such an important time right now in that we get to share and expose some of these micro inequities and larger inequities, right, in how professionals are being treated. So thank you for bringing that up. I do want to, though, bring up this conversation and bring in Marsha and Tim a little bit in how, though, do we have these really difficult conversations? So we know that about 20 years ago, we were talking about multiculturalism. And Marsha, I actually chose Occidental College as my college of choice because it was ranked #1 in multiculturalism in USA Today. And that was where I wanted to be. And I learned so much during my time there about these issues of injustice and inequity. And it led me to a career of diversity and inclusion. And so I knew 10 years later, we were talking about D&I, and now we're talking about DEI. And sometimes the J is in there too, diversity, inclusion, equity, justice. But what we're seeing today, and what we've seen since George Floyd's death and June 1st, is for people to make a pretty big leap. We're asking them to now talk about Black Lives Matter. We want them to go from diversity and inclusion and somewhat simple conversations around implicit bias, around what it means to bring people together that have many different backgrounds, identities, differences, thoughts, perspectives. So we're going from that conversation to a deeper, more intense conversation about Black lives. And I'm really curious about how, for Tim and Marsha, how are you doing that? How are you making that leap in your workplaces and in your networks?
So Tim, I'll pop in first, if that's okay with you. Before Orv, Dan also used this a particular word that struck me because it resonates with a conversation that I heard recently about the difference between protest and demonstration. We often think of those as being synonymous, but this notion that we have to move beyond just talking and really demonstrate through our actions that our commitments have soul and purpose in them is really important. So again, I'm fortunate to work in an educational environment with a group of colleagues that have spent a good part of their lives reading and discussing issues from a variety of perspectives and ideologies. And several things have come up in the last 2 years. So one of them on a very concrete level is a commitment to reviewing our college policies across divisions and departments for racist language or consequences as a result of those policies. So, and sometimes it could be just something minor, like not minor, but something as simple as someone is not included in the coverage of the policy, or it could be more widespread in terms of looking at, as a result of this particular policy, what are the implications for every single member of our community, regardless of color, gender, identity, et cetera. And if there are differences in how that policy affects them, then we have to look at how we can make it more equitable through policy changes. Now, the policy is one thing, then it becomes practice. And so in order for the practice to actually be different, that's where leaders in the organizations and people who are not leaders need to call each other out and need to bring to each other's attention what is happening and what isn't happening. And that does take a tremendous amount of courage to do. And not everyone is right there with that yet, but our students always are. So we've started involving our students a lot more in various committees, working groups, task forces, et cetera. So that's one big place. The other thing, I got to share this the other day with Reena, but I was really so enormously moved. We had a 2-day Board of Trustees meeting last Thursday and Friday. And during the chair's report, he addressed the board and said, you know, equity and justice, and those were the words he used. He didn't use some of the other terms that have been used in the past. Equity and justice are going to be front and center for our community for a very long time to come. And as a board, we need to understand what that means and do everything that we can as a board to support initiatives that are brought forth on this campus. And part of that begins by really and truly understanding the lived experience of our students in 2020. Because our board, a group of wonderful people, most of whom are alums, many of whom came to Oxy for some of the same reasons that you did, Reena, are also much older. Language has changed, experience has changed, understanding of what that real experience is has changed. And so they need to move up and forward with all of that. And finally, I would say that our institution recently elected a new college president. Harry J. Elam Jr. is Oxy's 16th president. He is a man of color, the second African-American president that we've had in our history. And our community is so excited to embrace him and his leadership. And he has made it absolutely clear that we as an institution will move forward. We will move the country forward through the work with our students and as an institution that has recognition regionally and nationally.
Marsha, thank you for that. I don't know that I can, keep up, but I'll say something I appreciate about what Marsha just discussed is kind of that sort of anti-racist systemic approach. Policies are either racist or anti-racist, and if they tend to uphold the status quo, then they're racist because the status quo is defined as unjust and racist. So in the arts, we've been having to really look in the mirror and evolve quickly. One of the reasons I joined the Washington National Opera is because of its artistic director, Francesca Zambello, who's been one of the foremost advocates for diversity in our field for decades. And yet, I'll tell you, she and I have been through a humbling journey over these last several months about really holding ourselves to a higher standard. As you said, Reena, not just diversity, but what makes our institution an anti-racist institution. I believe in the arts ultimately because I believe that the arts are about connection and connection across difference. I believe in the fabric of civic society. I know that institutions like ours are historically part of the problem, but we also have the opportunity because people serve on arts boards and exist together in arts audiences across, the total spectrum of political points of view and every other kind of diversity. But I chose political points of view there because I think that's important. When we declare ourselves an anti-racist organization and begin to take action in that regard, we generate a lot of discussion in a boardroom for an arts organization. Well, what's our role? Isn't our role just to provide an escape, for people, or is our role to try to change people in our society for the better? So the Kennedy Center has a position called Senior Vice President and Artistic Director for Social Impact. And his name is Mark Bamuti Joseph. And through his leadership, we put out an announcement not long ago, and I have to read the name of the announcement. It's my favorite name of a press release. It's called Long-Term Social Impact Initiatives at the Intersection of Arts, Culture, and Community to Support Anti-Racism at the Nation's Cultural Center, right? So in the announcement are 8 areas of commitment that we're committed to over the long term. And one of them is a project that the Washington National Opera and the National Symphony Orchestra are doing together called the Cartography Project. The Cartography Project. The Cartography Project takes the map of the United States and picks 8 cities at different points in the map to represent the entire country and 8 cities where the kinds of infamous incidents of extrajudicial violence have occurred, like Tamir Rice and George Floyd. And in those cities, we're commissioning composers who are people of color, who are the next generation and not yet established in their careers, to write a work that responds to the incident, but not in the spirit of like re-traumatizing the community, but rather to utilize the power of art as a force for healing, connection, and I would say truth and reconciliation, because we cannot begin to heal unless we go much further in facing the truth. And we in the arts have a role to play. So when we announce something like the Cartography Project for an opera company, again, that among the sort of white-led institutional structure, that generates a lot of conversation. And that has been a wonderful opportunity to try to make the stand. Yes, we're declaring that this work is intentional, and we're going to pursue it and hold ourselves accountable to actually making a difference.
Tim, I love the title for so many reasons, because it certainly breaks a lot of rules. It probably broke all the APA rules about how many words should be in a title, but it also certainly is breaking another rule around challenging whiteness, right? And supremacist thinking. And that is really incredible, especially right now. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm curious to go back, Orvin, to something you talked about in terms of hiring, and Dan, something you said around how are we going to move from talk to action? And that's been a theme throughout today's conversation. How do we really do something about this work? So Orvin, you talked about hiring. We know, we just heard the importance of doing this work on a board and leadership level. What about other pieces of this sort of pie? So policy, board and leadership development, pledges are critical right now in terms of accountability, right? Holding each other accountable to the work. What about things like, Orvin, you said hiring, recruiting, retention, vendor spend, supplier diversity. What about all these different pieces? How do these all help or hurt us in terms of moving from these simple concepts of diversity and inclusion to racial equity?
So what I would say is two things. One, I want to comment on something that Marsha said and just reframe it a bit. You know, I'm a trained social worker. I have a business degree. I have a theology degree, and I believe in the power of relationships, and I'm relational. And so I think that as a country, we've got to get to a point of calling people in and not out. As a country, it's so important. It seems so simple, but it's so important. You got to draw nearer to people in a period where we are so fractured as a republic. We got to draw near to each other, and that includes people who think different, who believe different, who look different. Period. We got to get back to some level of normalcy about what it means to be human. So that's the first point. Reena, in regard to the question that you made, you actually answered everything. So it's all of it. It's all of the above. But what I would say is when I count, and so it's about equity. And so when we look at the challenges in this country, and you look at every social ill, every challenge, mass incarceration, health disparity, disease, COVID, financial, the gap between white and black people are on the losing end of each area. And so what I'm simply saying is we have to move past theory to more concrete. Let's count. Let's get back to basic counts. And so when I talk about equity, I'm talking about being proportional. So if women represent 51% of the American population, women should represent 51% of certain jobs. If I'm in West Plains, Missouri, which may have a 3% Black population, and the population in Missouri is 13%, well, the Black population for employment would be 3% in West Plains. It's about proportionality. And so when you get to basic counts, you can't debate that. Now, obviously, there are outliers to this. You know, certain people go into certain kinds of jobs. I'm not a 6'5", 6'6". I'm not likely a basketball candidate. So, I mean, there are certain things that that direct us into certain kinds of careers, but you can't tell me when you look at higher education and you look at the disproportionate number of Black people on the negative side, Black and brown people on the negative side in higher education, that there's not something wrong. So there's something wrong for anybody who knows basic statistics. So what I'm saying is, on your board, at the board level, there are, in the Fortune 500 companies, I don't know if there are 2 Black people. In banking, in Main Street banking, tell me how many, name anybody on the call, name me a Black CEO of a bank. I can name you 1,000 white CEOs. So these are problems that we just have to work through. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Orv. And you know, where you started was acknowledging that all of the things that Reena mentioned are actions that businesses can take now, today, led by their CEOs, led by their middle management, led by their frontline staff, who can use their voices. Those are all things that they can, that businesses can and should do. Vendor spend, recruiting, conscious, intentional recruiting efforts, partnering with community colleges, partnering with high schools to develop the skills in communities, Black and brown communities. So those are some specific things. What I was thinking about as Orvin was talking and you posed the question, Reena, was, what can individuals do in their day-to-day lives as part of their businesses? And one of the things that I observe in my own behavior, reflecting on my own career, my own actions earlier in my career, and frankly, probably still to this day, is that when I am delivering feedback, or when I'm working alongside a woman, a brown guy, a Black guy, somebody that doesn't look like me, there's an inherent sort of nervousness or reluctance to deliver the honest feedback that may be a little bit more difficult, but then can help that person identify how they can improve and then take actions for actually how to improve. So I've got to be comfortable. First thing I have to do is develop a rapport with that individual from day one. And the way that I do that is by being vulnerable. A way that I do that is by being vulnerable and by opening up a little bit. And by giving a little bit of myself, they can start to feel a little bit more comfortable. Once I've established that rapport, I've got to be brutally honest. And they've got to know that it's coming from the bottom of my heart. I had this discussion literally last week with he's Mexican-American senior manager that I work with. And I said, I'll call him Johnny. Johnny, I'm going to be really honest with you. These are 2 things that you need to improve. And I'm not going to shortcut it. I'm not going to, be indirect. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. These are 2 things that you need to do. And I'm telling you this because if you don't do them, you're not going to get to the next level. What I'm also going to tell you is that I'm going to help you every step of the way. If I see you even sidestepping a little bit, I'm going to call it and I'm going to help you. But we can, every single one of us can every single day bring that honesty, but we've got to start with establishing trust, establishing that rapport. And I believe one of the most effective ways we can do that is to be vulnerable first and lead by example.
Dan, thank you so much. I love that you segued right into the personal piece. And so Dan, Tim, Marsha, for any of you, I'm really curious about what we do personally in this space. As individuals who are either white passing or identify as white, this conversation is really important in terms of what are you doing to, again, have the conversation authentically and honestly. So part of this panel was done by design in terms of having it cross-racial. In the past, every single conversation that was around diversity and inclusion had only Black and brown people on the panel, because we were the ones to speak out about our experiences. We were the experts. That's why when you look at diversity and inclusion directors across the board, they are Black and brown, majorly Black. And you see that this has really laid within us to do the education. And Orvin, I am so grateful that you said you are open, but not all Black people are open to having this conversation, because certainly people of color and Black people are not monolithic. But for many Black and brown people, we're saying we're done. This is enough. We have been talking and talking for decades, and we're just done. And so white people, now it's your turn to show up and to do the education. And so I'm curious for Marsha and Tim, and Dan, please feel free to jump in here. Is there anything in this discomfort and vulnerability that Dan talked about that sort of sits with you in terms of, is there anything that you think you might get wrong in this work, or that maybe you have gotten wrong in talking about racial justice and racial equity? Is there anything that kind of keeps you up at night? Tim, I know when you were thinking about how to respond to the pledge or to the letter, or Marsha, for you, as you're thinking about how to respond to faculty and staff and students, is there anything at all that has really proven for yourself to be something that you just need to work out as it relates to maybe your white fragility and your whiteness?
I'm glad you said white fragility. I read that book, and I literally read it 1 week after I should have read it, because it's actually a very eye-opening book. So the George Floyd protest movement grew to a point. There was like this weekend in June where the kind of turning point that many people have described on this call, I think really solidified. And that the week following that, I was scheduled to moderate a panel as part of the annual conference for Opera America, which is hundreds of, in this case, it was actually thousands because it was online, and thousands of professionals in our business. And we made kind of a game day decision. We were going to change the panel. I was supposed to moderate a panel on strategic realignment in opera companies. And then we decided we're going to make the panel about, racial justice and diversity as applied to our field. And the week prior, we had a panel that was on that subject, and it was a very carefully assembled panel, Reena, I think like the one that you're talking about. Well, so I had a choice to make. Am I still going to moderate this panel now that we've changed the subject and we added new panelists? Or is that a mistake because I'm a privileged, white male person and I'm not going to do well at moderating the panel? I made the decision to moderate the panel because I thought, well, it's my job. I'm the chair of the service organization for the field, and I'm not going to shrink from the challenge, although I will perhaps mess up. Well, I think I did mess up. In fact, we got a fair amount of criticism for the sort of white-centeredness of how the panel unfolded, even though it was a fairly diverse panel. And then like the week following, I read White Fragility, and I was like, I would have benefited from having read this before I tried that. In fact, one thing that happened is that Opera America publishes a magazine that's like the publication in our field. Somebody wrote a very critical article about this panel and me, and then we had the choice to make, all right, we're gonna publish the critique. We work in the arts, we get bad reviews all the time. So I think that was an important experience for me. Vulnerability is the word. We just have to keep showing up and being vulnerable, making mistakes, learning, and then not repeating the mistakes that we've learned from. And I have heard that message loud and clear. It is for the people who are white people, and especially people who occupy positions of leadership, to do the work from here. And all I can say is, I'm trying.
So, boy, I don't even know where to start with this, but I'll try and do it in a cogent fashion. So first of all, I think the thing that I worry about is doing harm by something I say or don't say, or do or don't do. And generally speaking, that's not how I approach most things in my life. I'm usually willing to wade in. I'm oftentimes the person that raises their hand first to ask a question, to say I don't understand something. But I have become very concerned, and some of that comes out of what I've been learning in terms of restorative justice, and really thinking in terms of harm done. And sometimes you don't have an opportunity to take care of that immediately, and you don't know how far down the harm can come. And this is particularly true working in an environment with young people, where things can move very quickly to a very serious point of safety and well-being. So I think that's part of one of the things I worry about. In terms of having gotten it wrong, one of the most difficult realizations, and I identify with Tim about white fragility, except that I read it about 3 decades too late. And recently I was reading something. I read a lot, being a librarian type, and that's where a lot of my growth comes from, is reading, because I can listen to that. But I picked up something, and there was mention of the last book that Dr. King wrote, called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? I never read that book. It was written in the 60s. It's now 50 years later, and so I bought it. I started reading it, and I thought, where have I been my whole life? And yet I tend to think of myself as being, thoughtful, compassionate, recognizing, where my biases lie. But, clearly I've not been engaging in all of the ways that I could have with the world that I live in order to make a difference. So that's distressing, but that's something that can be repaired. And that is work that I have to do. And that I get to do in concert with a lot of other people these days, and I'm really grateful for that.
Thank you, Marsha and Tim, and then I'm going to go to Dan real quick. I appreciate hearing those strategies so much. So in addition to having a social worker on everyone's staff, Orvin and I would promote that 100% as MSWs. It is so important, though. I mean, seriously, social workers, sociologists, anthropologists, they bring such an important lens to your workplace and climate. So certainly think about that. Think about reading. And Dan, I want to ask you to just talk about learning. You wrote a blog recently about how important it is to just listen and learn in this space. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the point I was trying to make in the blog was, when you listen, try not to listen to respond, try to listen to learn. Particularly in business settings, a lot of times we're listening because we're trying to solve a problem. And so we think that, oh, I need to respond. And when it comes to discussions around justice, equity, race, gender, I find that the most powerful element of listening is listening to learn, not to respond. Listening to truly understand. When Reena, if you and I are having a discussion, really trying to understand what you're saying from your perspective and internalize that. So that was the main point of that portion of the blog. More broadly, when I think about learning in the context of racial equity, racial injustice, for me, it's twofold. One, we're humans, we're animals, and we are the most capable animals that exist on the planet. And one of the reasons that we're the most capable animals on the planet is because we can learn so much so quickly. And if we're not learning all the time, then what are we doing? Is sort of how I think about it. What are we doing? So first of all, just as humans, we were born as humans. Many humans believe that we didn't influence the way that we were born, or that we were born. I share that view. But here I am, I'm a human, and I have the ability to learn so much. If I don't use that, then I'm wasting it. So that's just a fundamental, I guess, belief that I have about the importance of learning. From a business context, I think learning matters because in my estimation, if I am an employer, one of my most fundamental duties is to care for my employees and, in fact, to care for my customers. And one of the best ways that I can care for my employees is to encourage them to learn and to provide forums for them to learn and to provide resources for them to learn. Why is that caring? Because by them learning, they're growing as humans, and they may not be my employee 5 years from now, but what they will be is better professionals, better society members because they've learned, because they have that culture of learning. And by the way, a lot of studies out there say that whatever skills you have today, particularly in the business world, will be irrelevant in 5 years. So if you're not ready to learn, like that's a bummer, man, because you're going to need to in order to survive and keep a job. So we as employers also have that responsibility to create humans, to build humans who have the capacity and the drive and the desire to continue to learn. And in the context of equity and inclusion, if we're not learning, then we're not going to make progress. My experience is based solely on what I've lived. And for me to be a constructive member of society, I have to learn about your experience and I have to listen with intent to learn.
Thank you. And Dan, I want to take that point and Tim, kind of bring it back to you for a second. And I imagine that you would concur with Dan completely. And it is the reason that you started the first Diversity and Inclusion Committee at Opera in St. Louis about 10 years ago. It was something that I was very honored to sit on. And as I've shared with you many times, I had told you, I'm not the right person for this. I've never been to opera. I don't know anything about it. I don't think I'm right for this. And you said, no, that's exactly why we want you, because you've never been. And you learned so much, right, from convening this group of people who may never have had any interaction or engagement with the opera. And for me, I think I got more out of it than you did, because I actually then became an opera goer for many summers. And not only that, I was able to invite my parents to go to an opera for the very first time, right? And so there was so much connectivity that happened from just that first core concept of learning and the need and the urgency to learn from people who look different. Because I assure you, my husband and I were the only people of color in that opera when we went that night, and we stood out, and I'm quite sure that everybody was looking at us like, are you in the right place? But it didn't matter, right? Because this is how you do the work. This is how it begins. So Tim, just want to see if you want to respond to that. And then I'm gonna, as we conclude today, ask you all about how we have these really important discussions and next steps.
Reena, thank you for that. I guess one thing I want to say to expand upon what I said earlier about the concept in white fragility, and I think this goes to Dan's point about learning, because this is a difficult thing for white people to learn. The premise of the book is that the reason it's so hard for white people to engage well on issues of race and racism is because we benefit from the current racist systems, and that we actually know that deep in ourselves, but refuse to admit it to ourselves. And I think we are in this inflection point broadly in the culture where that reckoning is gradually occurring, person by person, and then therefore institution by institution. When I, so at the end of the day, I'm an idealist about the arts. And so I was very grateful to hear you say all that, Reena, because the arts only exist for the purpose of, connection, and that's the joy of especially the live performing arts. And so if the institution is behaving in ways that have created this incredible lack of inclusion and welcome over all of the years of its existence, my goodness, we have a tremendous amount of truth and reconciliation to achieve in order to undo all of that. But the potential for all that beautiful connection is there, because the arts are only about what is most important to all of us as human animals. I will say that one of the things that I think Orv was sort of referring to at the beginning of all this is like institutions playing against type. There's a certain power to that. When a corporation that's been generally way too cautious to speak in the past is suddenly speaking in a different way, this is part of what is creating the tipping point that we're referring to. So I hope I've somewhat answered your question. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted, as we again close, we only have a few more minutes, but I want to go back, Orvin, to something that you said in our prep call last week, which was really around, you can't force people to have this conversation. And I'm curious from your perspective, all of you, how do we, people to people, Tim, we just heard you say that. How do we bring people to this conversation when they're just not ready, when really the state of our nation right now is one of deep polarity, not disagreement. We are so polarized right now that we are not willing to sit at the table with people who have different perspectives than we do. And what we really need to do is move to a place of disagreement, saying it's okay. We can all sit, we can eat together, we can have a glass of wine, we can have coffee together, and we can disagree. And that's okay, because that is where this fundamental learning that Dan was talking about will evolve. But how do we do that? So Orvin, can you talk more about how we can't force people to the table?
So I'll be brief, Reena, because you really just hit the punchline in your summation there. But I really do believe that we are in a Pharaoh moment. And to me, when I think about the Pharaoh of ancient times, he was a frightening figure. As a child, I remember being terrified, learning about this man, this person who stood for absolute power. Pharaoh had a hardened heart, and he chose not to hear the cries of his people. So I am really concerned, going back to this idea of if this is a moment or is this a movement. I'm concerned that we, the people, won't acknowledge the interrelated man-made systems that conspire to keep some people powerless. I'm concerned that the hard hearts who make justice elusive for Black and brown people will not hear the cries for shared power and economic equity. No, we can't force people into this conversation, but those who are in powerful positions and who are silent, you are just as complicit.
You know, this summer, and before I say that, Orv, I wanted to also thank you for redirecting my comment that I made earlier about calling people out instead of calling people in. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to borrow that and use that regularly when I have the opportunity to do that. So thank you for that. You know, in June, CCEJ did a series of elements of justice dialogues that were focused around affinity groups. And I believe that part of that structure was to help people begin to talk with each other in ways that could then bridge beyond one's affinity group to other groups of folks. And I found it really valuable. And that was one of the conversations that we had then about is how do we continue this? So I view this as part of that continuation and other things that I have participated in. But when the video showed in the beginning of the Building Bridges youth camp, it was kind of tweaking something in my brain about wondering about opportunities to have immersive experiences for people over a period of days around equity and justice and what that might look like, who might be able to lead that. And I'm still working with that in my head to think about it, but that's where I landed after I saw that.
Thank you. And thank you for the beautiful modeling just now of dialogue, accountability, learning, everything that we did this afternoon. Thank you so much, Orvin and Marsha. Dan and Tim, any last words as we wrap up today about next steps in terms of how to bring people in to have this conversation?
Lead by example. Lead by example. Have the conversation. The way that you become more comfortable with things is by doing them. So we, all of us, particularly those of us who are white or white passing, we've got to lead by example, and we've got to have the conversation. It doesn't. You also have to not go too fast, but you can start by saying, "Hey, Orv, do you have a minute? Can I ask you a question? And I don't know how to ask this, and I'm probably going to mess it up, but I saw this in the news. You're Black. I could see that. How are you feeling?" Simple as that. We've got to do that, though. We've got to do that.
Orvin was ready. He was about to put himself off mute and say, "What, Dad? Yeah, what do you want to ask me?" I'll answer it. Tim, last word.
One of the most uplifting things that I've experienced over these last many months is Brene Brown's podcast called Unlocking Us. And there's a episode where she interviews Ibram Kendi, who wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I don't know, that to me was like two of the geniuses of our era in conversation with one another. And Brene Brown has this concept of wholeheartedness. To be wholehearted is to be to allow yourself to be vulnerable and therefore to fully engage. And I think that's the on a personal level, what we each need to achieve is wholeheartedness in this commitment. I agree we're in a hugely polarized moment, but we've got to reweave the fabric together. It's good that we've been pulling it apart, and now we've got to start weaving a new fabric.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. From the arts to higher ed to small business to big business, this has been an incredible hour of learning, of modeling, of listening. So thank you. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for sharing your journeys. Thank you just for being in community with me and with each other. It has been incredible.